Everybody, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Zactivist Speaks right here on LinkedIn Live for the Educators Incubator. It is an honor, a pleasure, and a privilege to talk about what I think is going to be a really important, critical topic with two experts in the field of education as well as history. We have with us Dr. Jesse Berger, noted historian, professor at Clark Atlanta University, and an educational thought leader. Dr. Berger, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for giving me this opportunity.
You know what? Thank you for making time for the opportunity. It's never easy to make time to educate after having worked and educated all day. But I'm so thankful that you're making the time. And joining us also is noted historian, change social champion, or is it change champion, social justice expert, business entrepreneur, publisher, the one and only R. Wayne Woodson. Dr. Woodson, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here this evening.
You know what? This is to me, this is like a critical topic. And in my preparation for being with you gentlemen and being able to talk about this topic, I've done some research, and it's really been surprising, even somewhat disappointing, the very strong, very radical nature of what's happening in American public education around Black History Month. I don't know if we've ever had a Black History Month as controversial as this. You gentlemen can perhaps school me on that. I can even say when President Ford made Negro History Week into a national month recognition as Black History Month, did we have this level of controversy?
So the reality is no. But at the time, we're in the 70s. You know, we were in the Black Power movement. The country was shifting. I think a lot of majority people thought this was their way of pushing this process forward. And then, you know, this is what we've done and we've done it and now we can move on. So there wasn't a lot of controversy at the time.
I agree with you, especially in the 70s, Ford, Carter years. There wasn't the controversy, but I think so many issues, problems have been so polarized this year in that people can take a word or three words and place a negative connotation on it. The 1619 Project, or even the race teaching about ethics and race in classroom. People have taken such a negative context about it. And it's something that we've been doing for quite some time. And I look at it, it should be something that's bipartisan, because it's not only a part of our history as African Americans, it's a part of American history, because my ancestors, your ancestors, we built this country and made it the country that it is today. And it's kind of surprising, or somewhat surprising, when people say, well, why do we teach Black history? Isn't Black history taught, or infused in American history? And I simply say, not as it should be. When I was in elementary school, rarely would I see a person of color epitomized in such a way where they show whereas they made a contribution to society. As a grown man now, I feel very shameful when we talk about Zorro and fighting the Indians. But do we understand the contextual knowledge behind all of that? And so now I think it's now important that we have Black history, that we have multicultural education on the forefront.
You know, I agree 100%. We all know this week we had a massive snafu in the world of maybe lighthearted journalism and media with Whoopi Goldberg and her anti-Semitic commentary that has really reverberated around and has caused a lot of good discussion, robust discussion, and highlighting a lot of biases in education around things that people perhaps really needed. This is my first question for you gentlemen, and it's going to go out. I want you both to kind of think about it, maybe answer. This is the question. Everything right now is really targeted and really geared towards this debate around critical race theory. And with both of you being noted educators, I want to know to what extent is critical race theory being even taught in schools that you know of?
No, I have not come across critical race theory being taught in the school from my perspective. I do believe that it is being taught, but as I stated earlier, I think it's taken out of context. As I've had to speak with one of my contemporaries, I love Southern culture. However, some aspects of Southern culture, they do not represent me. It was a harsh time for my ancestors, and even today, with police brutality and some of the hardships of racism. But I think as we evolve, we need to know the truth. When we look at Gone with the Wind, or when we read books from 10 years ago, it always says the slaves were happy playing a fiddle. And I don't think anyone could be happy working for free and working from sunrise to sunset. And the history books need to reflect the truth of the hardships.
And two, Dr. Berger, it depends on what books you're reading. I didn't read those books, but I know exactly what you're talking about. The stereotypical tropes that have perpetuated mainstream American thought around enslaved people. And Grace, you bring up a good point. While I prepare to go to Dr. Woodson, again, we're going to talk about that tonight. Virginia isn't the only state. There is now a total, I want to say 23 states 23 or 29 states by the end of January had laws in the process that will address and pare back critical elements of American history and American representation that will impact a number of marginalized groups, not just Black people, but really pretty much every marginalized group in the country. Dr. Woodson.
So I have this discussion with a lot of people, especially my scholarship friends. The truth is not critical race theory. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework which scholars use to analyze whatever. Teaching Black history or teaching the truth or teaching history is not critical race theory. I don't know of any public school in the country that is using critical race theory. I know a lot of scholars who are friends of mine who don't really understand critical race theory. Now, that is one of the frameworks of which I write, so I'm very well versed in it. But teaching history is not necessarily critical race theory. I think that we are now just using terms to try to nullify access to information and whatever the terms would be. But like I said, there are scholars that don't even touch critical race theory. So teaching the truth, the full and total truth about history is not critical race theory.
So, and that was one of the main reasons why I want two of you here is that we have, again, a variety of experiences, both of you having taught on multiple levels. Dr. Woodson, when you say that critical race theory is a framework that you're familiar with and that you use, can you break that down even further for our audience? Because there is so much confusion around this term. As an English major with 2 degrees in English, right? We definitely use a variety of lenses when we studied the criticism around certain texts. Like we would literally put on the Marxist lens, we put on the feminist lens, and we also put on a critical race theory lens, in addition to a number of other ways of analyzing a text, right? So you would do this intertextuality study or into this different reading. It was so long ago, please forgive me. But again, you would do this reading of a short story and look at how different lenses can see this work. Can you just break that down for our audience as simply as you can?
So I think the easiest way is an example. So if I'm looking, for instance, I wrote on Black male access to financial aid. So I looked at it from a racial standpoint. Is race a factor in the awarding of aid, or is it not? So when you look at critical race theory, you're using like any other lens that you would use, and you're using race to analyze, provide insight, challenge, to study whatever the topic is. I don't know if that is what's happening in an elementary school. I don't think they're coming in with a lens to analyze whether, slavery was slavery. Most people who work in public school, myself when I did, and my colleagues, are teaching the facts. They're not teaching how people should look at the facts. Now, at the college level, that's different. I've had professors of all kinds. But I mean, it's a lens. So you use critical race to analyze a problem, a topic, a text, and that is not what's happening, I would venture to say, in at least 90% of the classrooms across the country.
Principal Berger, what are your thoughts around, where we are now headed in public education with the threat of anti-CRCT rhetoric? What does this really mean for what we will be able to teach and then share with our children?
I think it's very, very, very vital that publishers that represent a myriad of individuals, Black, white, Hispanic, or Latino, Latinx, Asian, are there at the table when we're looking at literature review to disseminate amongst students in schools on the elementary, middle, and high school. Because I think in the forefront, all of those races and aspects of those races should be represented in publication. I will say within my 28 years in education, I have seen, not deliberate speed, but I have seen more of a multicultural context, especially with literature on the high school level. I have seen from social studies beyond Martin Luther King and George Washington Carver, I have started to see an influx of more persons of color being represented. However, more is not what we need. We need much, much more, should I say, represented with our publishers and disseminating information as it relates to history to our students.
I love it and I appreciate it. And I went back, gentlemen, to look at my research real quick, right? I pulled that phone out because I hate to not have my facts straight. And as of January the 31st, 32 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that would restrict the teaching of American history from a framework that considers the role of Black people in this country or other marginalized voices, whether they be Jewish voices, whether they be Hispanic, Latinx voices, or whether they be, again, the fight for the rights of women or members of the LGBTQIA plus community. And this research comes from Education Week. It's in a brief that they provided. One question that I want to know from you, Dr. Berger, as a historian serving learners at one of our nation's most honored historically Black colleges, one of our most honored Black universities, what value does the accurate teaching of Black history even hold in 2022?
I think it's profound in that I attended a high school that was predominantly white. And it was not until I had gone to a historically Black college or university did I understand the full thrust of my race, my culture. I was around individuals who, like myself, went to predominantly white high schools, but I learned about African-American history. I learned about the struggle. I learned about the heartaches and the pains that our people endured. You know, it just didn't start from 1619. But when we think about African-Americans have influenced our American society beyond standard. We have when we had the January 6th riot in Washington, D.C., that marble floor, as I looked at it, some slaves, some way, somehow, they were there to help build the nation's capital. When you think about Washington, D.C., how the city's laid out, Benjamin Banneker played a vital role with that. When you think about here in Atlanta, Georgia, right after the Civil War, Atlanta University was founded in a rail car. A lot of people don't even know it. It's because of Atlanta University. Now Clark Atlanta University, you have Georgia Tech. A lot of people don't understand the profound history that those schools in the Atlanta University Center have. Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, Morris Brown, Spelman, all of those. This city would not be the city that it is today for African-American people had it not been for the struggle of those people. And then you ask any common person that you see in this city, they don't know Atlanta had a race riot where African Americans were killed as a result of Red Summer. So one thing I always live by as a historian, if you do not know your history, you do not know your future. And one thing I do commend the Jewish people for, they make sure they instill in their children their history, their culture, and their heritage. And I think as African-American people, we must do likewise. I have a father and some uncles. They said, well, you know, it's kind of hard. I don't want to watch Roots, or I don't want to watch anything that's going to show how depressed our people were during that time. We must know, and we must teach our children the struggle that we endured, and therefore they must do better and better what they can for our students.
You know, I appreciate that, because I think that is a real issue right now in discussing history and why we are looking at maybe some levels of revision to that history from certain groups. Lydia says, if you do not know your history, you do not know your future. Love this quote, Dr. Berger, and completely agree. Lydia, I will address for you the question that you posed. I think it's really valid. It's a really good thing to bring up. This is a question from Lydia. I'm curious as to suggestions for the introduction of the very idea of lenses in elementary education, because critical race theory absolutely has a place for discussion and interpretation in higher education. Many scholars, especially sociologists, have expressed and posed the idea that racism can and or will always exist even without actual racists, because we have created an uncharted society where race somehow matters on a multitude of levels that the general public may not even realize. In regards to your elementary education, it's not necessarily a matter of a CRCT lens or even a racial lens, but what is important is that all children are validated in their existence and in their personhood. And that is something that education hasn't always done. There are a variety of children from a variety of backgrounds, and every single child deserves to have him or herself seen in their educational experiences and to have their home experiences or lived experiences honored. What do I mean by that? What I mean is when teachers select literature, they should be selecting literature that serves as a window and as a mirror, both, correct? So if I am as a Black male, a Black boy, I need to be reading Because of Winn-Dixie, because I don't relate to Because of Winn-Dixie. I don't have a dog on the prairie, but I can learn about what it's like to have a dog on a prairie from reading Because of Winn-Dixie. But in addition to this window into a new world, I deserve a mirror as well. And so I should be reading books that reflect my lived experiences as a Black child in America. And that's why a lot of books from a lot of places really do matter in the elementary experience. And if we provide kids with these mirrors and these windows, we will find that they have a framework for understanding each other despite their differences. And that's where the concept comes in, not CRCT lens, but windows and mirrors. Gentlemen, anything to add to that?
I think.
Go ahead, Dr. Berger. I think that we need to really just overhaul education just in general. The fact that we are discussing the elimination of aspects of history, whatever the aspect is an issue. And I think that what this does is begin to open up doors for impact to other areas. You know, I am not one of those people who believes that everything should be over policied or over legislated, because when you get to that point, you open doors to other things. So right now it's Black history. Well, what is it going to be tomorrow? And once we start giving these legislators authority to censor what is being taught, we have a problem. And you know, Carnegie Woodson has a quote, and I use it all the time: the oppressor has always indoctrinated the weak with his interpretation of the crimes of the strong. And so what this does is it allows us to revise history in a way that makes whatever group look better. And that's not healthy because everyone needs to understand the full scope. You know, like the Indians were not Indians. They were here before they got here. They were called Indians because Christopher Columbus thought he was in India. And so we revise the history in a way that eliminates anything that could be negative. Well, we learn from some of the negative. People need to understand the realities of slavery, that the people did not come here as slaves. They were brought here and enslaved. And those are two different concepts that need to be taught. And that's why I'm an advocate of teaching accurate history. It's not history if you're making it up. That's a fairy tale.
I agree wholeheartedly with you, Wayne. I think people will use critical race theory and not even understand the justification or the knowledge behind it. They will get on a bandwagon of listening to the negative aspects of it and not understand the full crux of the content of it. And I think that's what is going on, especially in these states. And it's a political flag that people are using now. But I always tell people with a political flag, talk to the individual, not the group or the people. Talk to the individual. And sometimes you have to enlighten them and let them understand that critical race theory, we're not saying don't be proud of your heritage, your culture. Be proud, but also be acceptance of others. I had a conversation with a friend about 5 years ago about a Confederate memorial. And they were just saying, Jesse, I don't understand. That's a part of my history. And I just had to simply explain to them. And looking at the annals of your history, your ancestors were not planters. Your ancestors did not own slaves. Your ancestors were almost beneath slaves because they were poor Southerners and they fought a cause that did not represent them. There was a legislator out of Alabama who said, why are we fighting this war? This is a planter's war, not our war. So I always tell people, understand the context of your history before you state something, what your cause is, what you're fighting for. If you want to galvanize support for a rebel heritage, that's you. I understand that. That's what you believe in. But also I want you to understand that lens of those slaves and how they were separated from parents. It's harsh. And people are just finally starting to see that, especially with the Emmett Till. I never really understood the full crux of Emmett Till until about a month ago. Because I used to always say, well, why would his grandfather let them just take him out of the house? But when I look at the history of Mississippi at that time, it was very, very harsh and dangerous for an African American.
Absolutely. And I think that's a beautiful point that was made, because there's a whole lot more that is connecting people in this country than that is dividing them. And that really makes me pull back to really think. This is something I've been grappling with, gentlemen. And for everyone watching, I've been grappling with how in the world has this taken hold. Nobody was talking about CRCT 2 years ago. No one cared. And I don't even believe in using the term, because I don't think that's the appropriate term for what people are talking about. They've taken a very small concept from the annals of academia and they have allowed it, or they have exploded it. And I found this online. Let me show you what I found, gentlemen. This is what I found. I found this, and it says from Christopher F. Rufo: we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the versions of cultural insanities under that brand. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with, quote, air quotes, I'm putting this in air quotes, Americans. Now, when I saw this in my research and prepping for tonight's conversation, I have to say that this man who posted this on Twitter in 2020 and 2021, March 18, 2021, he was dead on the money, because that's exactly what's happened. And from other research, it seems as though there are even more sinister moments underfoot. I don't think it's just about erasing history or reframing history. I think it's about wanting to find a way to stop people from canceling. I think it's about trying to also find a way to stop major corporations from hemorrhaging money when people make mistakes or do the wrong thing, like Whoopi Goldberg did on national television. And it's also about a way of taking money from public education. But we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit more as we go on. I just want to share this tweet that I found, because I really think that it's pretty valuable. And I found this, Candy, when I simply went on Twitter and I was doing a search on CRT. This is one of the many things that came up in that search. I do love Twitter for wanting to get a perception of what the people are actually out here saying. You know, Dr. Woodson, your extensive research has had a focus that has included historically Black colleges and universities. What role should our HBCUs be playing right now in this critical moment regarding the teaching of Black history and maintaining Black history as an academic concept?
So it's interesting. I just had a whole discussion with some colleagues of mine about this, that there are many HBCUs that do not have a mandatory African-American history course in the curriculum, which for me is a challenge. We cannot expect other people to know more than us about our own history. That's how these multiple narratives come about that have no point in accurate fact. I think that we have, in some ways, allowed our HBCUs to become just incubators, as opposed to what they were even when I was in school, which were the centers for new thought, which were the places where the change was happening. You know, if we even looking at the civil rights movements of the 60s, a lot of cities' movements started on those HBCU campuses. And we've gotten away from a lot of that work. And I think we need to get back to it. I think that although it was probably meant to be a negative, the recent bomb threats are shifting the way our leaderships are thinking about these schools. And what they meant, I'm sure, to be suppressive has really lit this fire in these schools to return to their roots. Because, I mean, even if we look at Dr. Faison, who is at Edward Waters University, he put out a post like, we are not intimidated by you. And we will continue to do even more to move our culture and society forward. And that's what HBCUs were at one point. They were kind of like churches. You know, the community would be there. They would have events not just for the students, but for the community as a whole. They were the center where people went. I was in the cabinet at Payne, and I would hear stories about how the community would come to Payne's cafeteria and sit with the students. And I think that we need to return back to that intergenerational interaction, because we're losing a whole group of people. Now, we also know that a lot of those decisions are made by our young students in the middle school, but HBCUs used to come to the middle schools. When I was at Morehouse, we were at high schools and middle schools doing recruitment, but also going and just volunteering. And I think for especially young Black males, we would always hear them saying, like, you're in college, because for many, that's not a reality. So if I had one thing, I think that our HBCUs need to revisit the purpose in which they were founded and return to a lot of the work that was originally done. Because although we are smallest in terms of higher ed, we are still producing more scholars in every field, in every profession. And so I think that what has been meant this week to be deterrent probably has had the opposite effect.
That is genuinely the hope, right? I think if nothing else, I saw a tweet, I don't know if I captured it for the slideshow, that said, if nothing else, CRCT will forever be in the annals of history because of this moment. People who never heard of this term, never thought of this term, now they know it because of the massive amounts of legislation and dialogue around it brought to the forefront by conservative advocates wanting to see changes made in American public education. I want to know my next question, kind of goes into really, all of the different movements out there in regards to what's happening in our schools. And I just kind of want to know, gentlemen, is there anything that we can do as either educators or concerned citizens to pull back on the movement of this narrative? Because I think a lot of it is misinformation and even disinformation, like information that is purposely being taught or told people wrong. And here we have the Moms for Liberty co-founder Tina, who claims her group doesn't want to ban an MLK book, but wants to ban the teaching of the book Ruby Bridges from using the N-word. And she said in this video I saw, parents need to have that conversation about the N-word, not the school district. Are we getting to a point where where teachers can't even talk about language that isn't appropriate in a school?
Yes. It's very disheartening. I want to touch on 2 points. First, the N-word should not be used. And I think even people using it with African Americans, it should not be used. We never hear of other ethnicities using those derogatory words, which there are derogatory words based on various ethnicities. So we need to stop that or cease from that. It amazes me how people like to read about non-confrontational history as opposed to understanding and embracing there were some hardships. And for a mother, I always would like to ask the mother who talked or mentioned about Ruby Bridges, think about Ruby Bridges' mother. Her child was sacrificed for so many of us when we thought about integration. This little girl, 5, 6, or 7 years old in a hostile environment, but she was the sacrificial lamb of integration. I think that was brave of her. That was a phenomenal act on the part of her parents, as well as this little young girl. It was very, very thought-provoking, but it goes back into people understanding the context behind their statements and understanding the history behind it. Sometimes people think as long as it's a joke, being jovial, as long as it's athletic, then it's acceptable. But the minute that an African American states, I have a problem with this, then it's always perceived as confrontational or combative. And it shouldn't be that way, because I believe everybody on this face of this earth have an opinion, and their opinion should be valued.
To what extent are we seeing the anti-CRT movement? And are people doing enough in educational circles to fight against the will of conservative advocacy groups that want to see the revision of American history?
I think every educator in the state of Virginia during the election of the governor should have been marching, because as an educator, I can't go to Delta Pilots Association and demand that they fly a plane this way or that way. There is a process and a procedure. But I think a person lost their candidacy in Virginia based on this race theory. It went out of context. But I think people and individuals are going to have to start speaking up. You have people speaking up against it. You're going to have a debate on the issue to let everyone know that your voice is heard as well.
I think so. This is my challenge. And I had a conversation with Dr. Allen, who's at ITC, on this concept. And our people, for the most part, have become, reactionary. We are movement driven. So we had the civil rights movement, but then what do we do after that? Then we had the Black Lives Matter movement, but what do we do after that? Now we're sitting here waiting for the next movement. And I really do, whatever people's personal views may be of Gandhi now, because he's been blackballed now, but be the change you want to see says you need to be involved. So parents in these communities have a lot more power in many cases than those of us who run school systems, or who are in classrooms, or who are administrators at colleges. But what I'm not seeing is, like you're saying, Zach, a lot of those anti people. Like my parents would have been at the meetings protesting. And so I think that is the part that we're missing. We'll have a whole conversation in the living room at the house about how crazy stuff is, but then we don't go out and impact the change. Or for instance, in Atlanta, we had all these young people running. Most of them didn't win because those of us who should have voted for them were at home looking at the election on the TV. So I think that we have to become more involved in the process, as opposed to having these same old tired discussions at home, or just having an opinion and not making any action. That's the parents, that's the college students have impact on these campuses, whether you are at a HBCU or a PWI or MSI. Students on those campuses have a lot more power than they realize. And so I think that's what we need. We have to start getting in these places to have these conversations, getting on some of these racist school boards, starting that grassroots work before it's time for somebody to vote. You can't come in at the last minute and then be like, I'm running for something, nobody knows who you are. Khalid in South Fulton has been active since the city was established. So whether people liked him or not, he had a standard that people knew he was going to work. And that's what we need. I'm always using Carter G. Woodson quotes, but we need more workers. And I think that will start shifting things.
I agree.
And for the record, Dr. Woodson is the great grandnephew of the one and only Carter G. Woodson. So as we celebrate and recognize Black History Month, we always have to take a moment to recognize the seminal author of the Miseducation of the Negro and the foundational work laid down in the teaching of Black people in this country from the one and the only Carter G. Woodson. So honoring your ancestor, who was all of our ancestor, and the historian that laid the foundation for this celebration that became a national recognition under President Ford. I think that you're right, but I really have to say this in the defense of, now I want to see more politicians emerge who have the heart for the work, who have the heart for the advocacy, and who have the stamina to stay the course. Because you talked about a lot of young people progressives ran, and they lost, and now they're gone. Okay, they were a flash in the pan, and they were not married to the work, or the work wasn't a calling over their life. But the way that authoritarianism works is that it is exceptionally strategic and highly organized. And their focus includes a revision of history and rewriting history and the omission of voices that don't matter to their plan for control, dominance, or whatever you want to call it. And they're prepared to lose many battles because they're trying to win the ultimate war. And we are, those of us who are opposed to authoritarianism, maybe who are supporting democracy, fighting for public education, they know that we're going to tire of the fight. And I believe right now, a number of people who staunchly believe in anti-CRT movement, they're tired and they're exhausted. They thought that they were winning the battle when the monuments came down in cities all around America that were erected as statements of oppression of Confederate leaders. They thought they had won the battle when they changed the Confederate flag in Mississippi. They thought the battle was over, but what they didn't realize, it was just beginning, that it was one fight in a long-term war, and they gave all they had for those things to happen, and they had nothing left to give. People don't have the stamina to continue to fight, and they're always playing defense. They're never playing offense. And not only are those who are anti-CRT, but I think progressives and Democrats in general have no offensive strategy in this game. They're constantly playing defense, and you can never win a game always playing defense, and you are going to tire out quickly, as we are seeing. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope that we get there, but it worries me. And I think the bigger issue at foot is what I see from this educator, Piper from Missouri. She ran for, I think she ran for representative for Missouri. She lost, but she's still active and she's still doing the work. She said the right has been focused on destroying schools for decades. Every weird bill, cameras in classrooms, CRT, is to this end to privatize public schools, to profit from kids, to wrestle power from every community and give it to grifters. It's all a scam. This statement to me was profound. Gentlemen, I just want to know your thoughts.
Well, I will say I do believe there is a grassroots group that has an agenda to demise or diminish public education. I think public education is a good asset. A lot of our politicians are people who have and continually contribute greatly to our society, are products of public schools. As you mentioned earlier, I think it's so important, be it Republican, be it Democratic, be it independent, we all should be at those tables in the discussion arenas. I think it is so important when people talk about how bad public education is. We need to have that same type of energy talking and rewriting the narrative of how good public education is, because there's some great teachers in public education, great administrators, and great students. Private schools, from my observation, there are some public schools that can go toe-to-toe with private school education. And I'm a strong believer that my tax dollars, what I pay into, provide good quality education for all students.
Yes, Dr. Woodson.
You know, I'm always, let me preface what I'm saying, Dr. Pickett, who's a very dear friend of mine, we have these conversations regularly, because I was anti-charter school, anti-everything other than public education, partially because I'm from Detroit and I know what Betsy DeVos did with those charter schools in Michigan and pretty much has destroyed one of the top school systems in the country. But I do think that the conversation needs to be resourcing our educators. I have a challenge with the fact that when a school is underperforming, the first thing we do is cut the funding. Well, now, no organization can improve if they're defunded. And I'm using defunded correctly, not how they're talking about the police. I have a whole other concept with that. But they're cutting funding to the schools that are underperforming, but some of those schools need the resources more. I am a product of private schools, but I also went to public schools. The high school I went, Renaissance in Detroit, was a blue ribbon national school that could rival any school in the country and had 100% graduation and college acceptance rate. So I think Dr. Berger is absolutely correct, but it's the same thing we do with Black history just in general. Write our own narrative. Unfortunately, social media points out the 5 or 6 problems in the country, but most people are not posting the positive things. And so there's an element here where we have an opportunity to shift that narrative. We can start, like he's saying, promoting some of the positive things. Like the year that the National Spelling Bee champion was an African-American. You know, this is a national event. Most people in our community aren't even aware, but they are aware that in Augusta yesterday, some 12-year-old boy beat up a 12-year-old girl, because that's what we're promoting. And I think a lot of this narrative, unfortunately, we're promoting ourselves. We have become a culture that thrives on other people's misfortune. And now I'm a social disruptor, and you know, I can say controversial things all day and people can inbox and everything else. But the truth is the truth. We need to stop perpetuating this foolishness if we want things to change. We can't get mad at other people for continuing, like, what is the world star, hip hop, and all these things that are showing nothing but the negative aspects of our culture.
And I think one of the things, we've got to go back to the family. We've missed the family. The family played an integral part in our culture and our race, where the household is headed by a father and a mother. Children go to their neighborhood churches. I think our social organizations, our fraternities, sororities, Masonic, social organizations, we have to have one agenda, because we're missing the target. Because I see it daily in education with young boys and girls. We must have a focus for our young children because they are lost. If we can go to a convention and spend $3,000, can't we do something in a town hall meeting to say, hey, this is what we need to do for this school in Southwest Atlanta? We need to provide our own wraparound services with the mothers and the fathers and the children of that school to help them. And I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
We just got to rewrite that narrative and have a different focus.
You know, I'm sure that Candy is probably talking about the mother-father part, because Jesse, not every Dr. Berger, everybody's not gonna have a mother and father. Those are situations beyond individual control. But what is within the control of individuals
or mentors,
or is the need for, like you said, greater community focus and involvement.
But I will say this:
we really don't have communities.
But I will say this, according to research, and I have seen it, when there is a father in the household, there's a difference 9 times out of 10.
More money. Well, if he works.
Yeah. You
know,
a productive father.
Yeah, there's a variety, but again, in our society, community organizations should play a pivotal role in supporting the needs of the community, especially at times like this. The COVID-19 pandemic and the time that we're currently living in calls for more resources and more support to be provided across the country. And those organizations don't exist anymore in the way that they used to. And organizations and things that used to stand in communities either are no longer there or they have been repurposed, and they have become a part of the capitalistic driven engine to make money instead of serving the community. And unfortunately, gentlemen, the same can be said for many churches as well. For me growing up, the church played a much larger role in supporting communities, and that's no longer there. I'm going to turn over to Dr. Woodson. And before I turn it over, I want you both to think about this, because this is the whole point of tonight's discussion, is what are some key things that must be done to teach Black history in 2022. We're going to do each of us will give 2 different things, and I'm going to make a wonderful infographic about it to summarize this discussion and post it throughout the week. So think about that, but Dr. Woodson, take it away.
I just want to say that I think more so than the gender-specific people in a household is the love and support that's present in the home. I have friends that grew up in the house with their grandmothers who are much more successful and more balanced than I am. I think that what we're lacking really across the board is not just a family structure, but just support. And some of that I think really has to do with this litigious society we're in. You know, there were a lot of male organizations that were really active in Detroit when I was a young person, and not just our fraternities, but others. But, now people are afraid they're going to be sued. The schools won't let people in to provide support because they're afraid they're going to be sued. And so it really sometimes ties the hands of people. Even a lot of churches now have stopped offering after school programs and things because of the legalities of that. I think we've become such a litigious society that people are afraid to help. I mean, I had a friend of mine years ago who did not take a student of another ethnicity on a choir trip. That student said that he had molested him. Even by the time they found out it was all a lie, his career was destroyed. He and his family had to move to the other side of the country to try to rebuild his career. And so I think that I'm not sure how we address that issue, but I know even me, I very rarely go into public school settings these days because of what I'm afraid could happen. If they break out in a fight or whatever. Now, I have friends at schools who I know support the students in a different way. But I think that's a challenge for people. I am not one to say that it all is at the home, but I do believe that the home plays an integral part. The schools cannot be expected to parent our children. The schools cannot be expected to provide all the care. I had a parent a few weeks ago tell me that, I don't have daycare, and so my child's going to have to go to campus right now because they have to be in daycare. Your child is 13 years old. And so the concept now, I think, for a lot of people, and not to sound harsh, is that the school really is somewhere their kids can be while they're trying to manage life. And that's a different concept. Parents during my younger years, you would see them at the school, they were involved. And I think it's a different concept now that I think we want the schools to manage all of the educational process. And that's not possible.
Absolutely, and it's not possible for schools to do all the functions of society that people want for them, and that is why you need community organizations to be active. That is why you need churches in communities to be active. They have a role to play that isn't being played, and as a result, schools are being forced to take on all of that. Gentlemen, now let's talk about the 6 things that must happen when teaching Black history in 2022. Would anyone like to go first? Or if not, I can, start. And our viewers, I want you to drop in your comments some things that you also think must be essential in teaching Black history in 2022.
I think equality and equity should be a focus that we should look at as we look into the future. I think it's imperative that we teach Black history, because Black history is American history. Because as I stated earlier, African Americans have made such a phenomenal contribution. It also brings about an awareness, and it enhances a broader mindset to critical issues. I read an article the other day, well, should my child, I think that critical race theory makes my child feel sad, that they feel responsible. I don't think anyone should feel responsible. We're just acknowledging, yes, this did happen. And I think it's important as African Americans or whomever it may be, that we make sure that African American history is taught in schools, and not just African American history, Asian history, Latinx history, women's history, Irish history, because this is the melting pot, the pot of soup, gumbo, you name it. We are all here, and we all play vital roles and contribute to this American society.
So I would like to start by saying, I think we need to stop teaching Black history as if it started with slavery. That there's a whole period of history before we were brought here that often is omitted in the process. And I think that will begin to open up some different conversations if we stop focusing so much on just the negatives. And then I also think we need to make it tangible and relevant. There are Black history figures that are still alive. Everybody is not deceased. I think that is critical as we tie the history to the future, that we acknowledge that there are history and change makers that are currently living. Now, we might not have them much longer. I was a musician for a while. Leontine Price, who was probably the most prominent African-American opera singer in the world, is with us. So I think that is critical as we study this, because the argument often with me, with other individuals, is everybody's dead and that has no point of impact for me. But that's not accurate. There are history makers that are moving and making history now. So I think we need to better connect the historical aspect with moving forward and the impact it just has on our culture.
I think that, I think both of you have said some really great things. And again, equity must be a focus. Equality must be a consideration from Dr. Berger. Black history does not start with slavery, and we must extend the teaching of it from Dr. Woodson. We must ensure a multicultural focus of a variety of marginalized groups as we look and explore and revise the historical curriculum that's taught to our kids from Dr. Berger. And it must be tangible and relevant, with the emphasis that Black history is still happening and still occurring right now today. And if it's relevant, it's that we're reaching out to those history makers and bringing them into the conversation for our students so they can see it. Now, Candy stated that there should be an emotional component as well to help children deal with the residue or the impact of slavery. I would agree with that. But also, when you were talking about the parents are saying that my child feels bad, I never had anyone ever say that. I taught high school. Lydia was a former student. You tell me, Lydia, if I'm wrong. But we read Beloved by Toni Morrison as a class. We broke it down. We analyzed it. We pulled it apart. We explored the nature of slavery. And I don't really think anybody felt bad in terms of like, I feel guilty or I'm being made to feel ashamed of it. I think it's a matter of, this is history. We all know this is history. It's about what do we do to ensure it doesn't happen again, and how do we move forward. And I think that a lot of this is being projected onto kids more so than what they themselves may even feel. I think even Kenny, I don't even necessarily know if that residual impact of slavery is something that most kids even think about. I think it takes a level of maturity that many kids don't even have to be able to conceptualize those concepts. I myself did not understand slavery in the way that I do now until I read Beloved, until I read that book. It wasn't as real for me. I would have to say, gentlemen, I agree with everything that you said. And what I would add in is that we need to have more voices at the table when state standards around history or the social sciences are created. I think that's a huge part of the problem, is that in a number of states, the people who write the standards are not from diverse backgrounds, and they don't even understand the historical ramifications of what's happening. And there's nothing wrong with someone who has always taught history being and leading that work, but sometimes you have to go beyond the classroom expert and bring in the academic expert to pair with the classroom expert, as well as the historian and as the curator, as well as the librarian, all of them coming together in order to really set the tone at the state level. Corey Sanchez-Smith, national SEO expert who joined me last week, says, as the only brown kid in my elementary class, I felt horrible every time slavery came up. So thank you for that point of fact. So I recant my statement and go back to say, Candy, yes, we need that emotional support. Gentlemen, I love to always close these conversations with a lighthearted activity and game that reveals some things. And this is what we're going to do. I'm going to give you each a question, and I want you to tell me your answer. And I'll start with you, Dr. Woodson. We need more blank, and we need less blank. We need more.
We need more action, and we need less talking.
Need more action. We need less talk. Dr. Berger, I wish more people knew blank.
I wish people knew more history and less negativity.
And less negativity, right? And Dr. Woodson, you need to read blank.
So many. I of course, I'm an advocate for the miseducation of the Negro. But I would say that everyone should read The Souls of Black Folk.
What about Up from Slavery?
Well, I'm an avid reader, and if you could see this bookcase over, it's about 600 books. I would just put a period. I wish more people read! Exclamation point.
Well, that's a very diplomatic and nice way to define that. And Dr. Berger, you need to support blank. So all of our listeners out there, what is one thing that we need them all to get behind? You need to support.
positive endeavors that have an influence on positive situations.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. This has been a pleasure. It has been a lot of fun to indulge you both in such a heavy topic. I know it's heavy. I know it's a lot. I appreciate this. I know that our educators are going to value the playback. This is going to remain on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube to be shared out. I'll have clips coming next week, and I'll be sharing them also on LinkedIn. Both to you, thank you so much, and I look forward to working with you both in the future. Have a great night. And to everyone watching, thank you so much for your time. Candy, I agree. It was a pleasure for me, and I definitely gained some insight from our two doctors, Dr. Woodson and Dr. Berger. Good night to you all.
Good night.